It seems it is a short step from the narcissistic fantasy that you are the world's greatest victim to thuggishly lashing out against those you imagine are your victimizers. Brendan O'Neill in The Spectator, March 29th, 2023. This is Dr. Avenir. In England's The Spectator magazine, generally conservative, the estimable Brendan O'Neill posed the question, is the cult of victimhood turning violent? The question is rhetorical. The implied answer is yes. I might amend the answer only to say that it turned violent a long time ago. O'Neill opens with, "This week I read the most extraordinary and chilling statement. It was issued by a fringe group called the Trans Resistance Network. It was about the horrific gun attack at the Covenant School, a private Christian school in Nashville this week." O'Neill continues, "Shockingly, the Trans Resistance Network's statement contains just one paragraph on the barbarism at the school and six paragraphs on the troubles facing trans people like Hale." Hale refers to Audrey Hale, the perpetrator of the shooting. "That is," he continues, "it expresses fleeting sympathy for the slaughtered and lingering sympathy for the person suspected of carrying out the slaughter." Well, now really the person known to have carried out the slaughter. Continuing on, O'Neill writes, "The statement says there were two tragedies in Nashville yesterday. The first was, quote, the loss of life of 3 children and 3 adults, end quote. The second was the killer felt he had no other effective way to be seen than to lash out by taking the life of others." It then goes on at length about the virtual avalanche of hate and oppression faced by trans folk. It sounds paranoid in parts. Some right-wingers seek, quote, "nothing less than the genocidal eradication of trans people," end quote, it says. Sounds paranoid? It's bat guano crazy. It's utter madness. Avalanche of hate and oppression faced by trans folks? When have these nuts been anything but completely coddled lately? The shooter was a deeply disturbed, crazy young woman pretending to be a man who probably thought she was doing manly things by running around shooting and killing people. And I'm sorry, but that's crazy, and we should all be somewhat sympathetic to her in her status as a mentally ill person, but that's as far as my sympathy will extend. That's as far as anyone's sympathy should extend. This piece of human excrement snuffed out the lives of 3 8 and 9-year-olds and 3 adults in an elementary school. I say, her, and everything she represents. O'Neill goes on to do a very cogent analysis, suggesting that the cult of victimhood is moving into a much more violent phase. He poses it again, the rhetorical question, is the politics of victimhood moving into its violent phase? To which I would respond, when has it not been violent? For how many years has it been, or I should say, how many years has it been, since the last time you felt safe to speak freely without worrying about whether or not you were hurting some snowflake's feelings, and if you were to hurt that snowflake's feelings, whether or not you might lose your job, you might lose your friends, you might lose your family, your livelihood, your career, who knows, you might even lose your life. And why? Well, because violence is overwhelmingly a phenomenon, a characteristic, a trait of the left. And how would you feel if something like that were to happen to you? Do you think you might feel violated? Do you think that might feel as if an act of violence had been perpetrated against you? After all, violence and violate come from the same root words. They're obviously very closely related in meaning. No, if you look at the cult of victimhood, it's been calling for really outlandish, outrageous violence for a very long time. Look at black people, the black racists who call for literally the elimination of white people. There are a lot of such calls on the fringe, but they are amplified by the media as if they're legitimate calls for legitimate action, or as if they're legitimate expressions of legitimate anguish. They're not. Let's face it. America is the least racist country that has ever existed. Look at feminists who look you straight in the eye and will say to you that all men are bastards, that all men are bad, all men are evil, all men are oppressors and rapists, and who barely control their misogynistic hostility toward women and are awaiting just the merest of provocations before they go out and assault every woman they encounter. The cult of victimhood is of the left. Therefore, it is violent. All facets of leftist ideology are violent, and not even at the fringes. Violence is a central part of the way the left proposes to overthrow society and to remake society in its own vision, with the left in complete control. A fault that we constantly exhibit, we on the right, is that we're constantly asking the question, are they finally going too far? Are they thinking of going too far? Are they becoming violent? Are they becoming extreme? And the answer is no. They became all those things a long, long time ago. And we were asking the question back then, are they becoming violent as they bombed courthouses back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s? Just last year, the political left has been violent for longer than anyone's been alive. This was a core principle of Marxism, that eventually the left, which is what Marx was a part of, would overthrow the existing order through violence. Karl Marx was essentially the founder of today's cult of victimhood. And he certainly had some legitimate critiques of his day's prevailing government systems, but he was as wrong as he could possibly be in his proposed and predicted remedies. Certainly today's victimhood cultists are Marx's ideological sons and daughters. Marx was predicting things like the Nashville School shooting all the way back in the 1800s, the 19th century. We're in the 21st century now. We should have assimilated long ago that they mean what they say when they talk about overthrowing the existing order with violence. This core principle of the political left is always going to produce things like the Nashville School shooting. If you add into the equation the fact that Audrey Hale was obviously crazy, obviously a nut job, you're going to get things like this inevitably. Why are we surprised when it happens? Why are we on the right surprised when this type of thing happens, perpetrated by leftist psychos who have long advertised that they're going to do it? Why are we surprised by such things? We should not be anymore. To repeat, the left has been violent for longer than anyone's been alive, and the cult of victimhood is a major component of the political left itself. So of course it's becoming more violent because it's always been violent, and it's always worked. And that's at least partially because we on the right are constantly asking whether it's becoming more violent and not recognizing that it's always been violent. That it's violent by its very nature. That its foundational principles center on violence as a means to achieve its goals. And having to deal with it from that perspective, if you deal with something that you know has tipped over the edge into the unacceptable, then you deal with it differently from if you think the thing is becoming unacceptable or if you think the thing is becoming worse. We know the left is violent. They always have been. We need to deal with them that way, and we need to deal with them as if they are threats to domestic security, threats to the safety of all the people. These are the domestic terrorists everyone's talking about. And by the way, that's the reason the left is constantly braying about the right and parents at school board meetings being, quote, domestic terrorists, end quote, because they want you to look away from them. They who are the actual domestic terrorists, who are actually willing to perpetrate violence. Remember last year, they basically burned down how many cities in America? That was the left. That's domestic terrorism. That's genuine domestic terrorism. That's actual violence, and it all came from the left. All of it. None of it came from any parents at school board meetings. But those were the headlines about the parents at the school board meetings who were practically domestic terrorists, and we even had an actual Attorney General of the United States of America opening inquiries into how he could make sure that parents at school board meetings were not going to go berserk. It's the very same thing as when the thief robs the liquor store, and when he runs out of the liquor store and sees the cop, he tells the cop, "He went that away." Same exact thing. So I applaud Brendan O'Neill for posing the question, is the cult of victimhood becoming violent? But he really should be able to answer that question quite easily and say yes, the cult of victimhood has become violent. It was violent when it started, and it'll become even more violent as long as violence works. I'll leave a link to the Brendan O'Neill piece in the description below. It's an interesting piece, and Brendan O'Neill is a wonderful writer, and he's very, very observant, and I've long admired his work. But at this point, as I say, he's posing the question just a bit too late. The cult of victimhood, like the left itself, has long been violent. You can ask the people who lost their careers, jobs, and livelihoods because they said something that inadvertently hurt the feelings of some stupid snowflake somewhere, or wounded the tender sensibilities of some crazy man pretending he's a woman, or some crazy woman pretending she's a man. Of course those people are going to have a greater propensity to violence. They're crazy, and we do neither society nor the crazy people any favors by pretending that they're normal. Let's keep in mind, the shooter in the Nashville school shooting is dead also. How was her case treated appropriately by society around her? She plainly needed help. She plainly needed institutionalization of some kind. Instead, I'd bet you my life savings that she got nothing but affirmation, nothing but feedback about how stunning and brave she was. Yeah, stunning and brave, as she shot 8- and 9-year-olds. She wasn't stunning and brave, she was crazy. She was psychopathic, and as a society, we need to recognize that transgenderism is crazy, and crazy sometimes goes into psychopathy, and crazy sometimes goes out and shoots 8- and 9-year-olds in Nashville schools. We all want deeply to improve society, but you can never do that if you can't properly identify the problems that society actually faces. Transgenderism is crazy. Transgender people are crazy people. We don't have to be cruel to them or mean to them, but the cold hard fact is we do them no favors in pretending that they're not crazy. We certainly did those poor people at the Nashville School no favors in not having dealt properly with Audrey Hale long ago. You can very properly say to me, but Dr. Avenir, what would you have done long ago with Audrey Hale? Well, the answer is simple. Certainly not what was done before, which was nothing. In other words, to have handled her appropriately would have been to do something very different from what was done. What was that? Well, certainly in her case, institutionalization, and that's not going to be true of all transgender people or for all transgender people. But let's face it, they certainly need far greater supervision, and if Audrey Hale had had that greater supervision, she never would have obtained those guns, and the Nashville School shooting victims would be alive today. The very last thing that Audrey Hale needed was affirmation that she was stunning and brave. She wasn't. She was crazy.